So, Sauterne. You know, we sold a ton of it with the 2001 vintage and the 2003 vintage and the 2005 vintage and the 2007 vintage. And then Sauterne kind of lost its flavor. Not that it lost its flavor, but it's lost its flavor for people actually buying the stuff. And it's kind of a bummer because Sauterne is good, but you know the funny thing about Sauterne? I've had a bottle of Sauterne in my refrigerator for like a year. It's like people just don't think about Sauterne, which leads me to my next subject. Well, if you're not selling a lot of sweet wine, then we can make some dry wine. And you know what? Sauterne makes great dry wines. And in fact, many of the Sauterne houses are now making dry whites. And in the beginning, it was like, you know, you had Y d'Yquem. That was like kind of the big and fancy one because it was Chateau Yquem's dry wine. And then you had R de Reissac, you know, because they did the Y, we might as well do the R. You had G de Guiraut, and then you had S de Suduiraut. There might have been a couple other ones, but those were kind of like the main ones. And you know, Kyle and I remember we were talking with a couple Bordeaux people, and you know, we're like, why doesn't they have a Sauterne Sec? You know, why is it have to be AOC Contrôlé Bordeaux Sec? Because it can't be called Sauterne Sec because it's dry. But it comes from Sauterne, and it's made by the Sauterne people. So why can't they have Sauterne Sec? Because that'd be kind of cool to have on the label Sauterne Sec, I think. But they don't. And unfortunately for the Sauterne people, I think they're starting to make a case of this, and rightly so, because the wines that come from Sauterne, the dry whites, are very different from the wines that come from, let's say, Pessac-Léognan or Entre-deux-Mers or other parts of Bordeaux where they make white wine. So let's talk about this. So this one is from Chateau Suduiraut, who, as you know, is one of the greatest Sauternes, sweet wines. And they started making S de Suduiraut. But you know what? As time went on and the white wines became popular, they started to make a lot of different variations. So now you have 4 dry white wines coming from the property as opposed to just one. There still is an S de Suduiraut, but it's an S de Suduiraut Vieux Vin. It's an old vine cuvée. And then they have other Suduirauts, which is all Semillon, or another Suduiraut, which is another old vine Suduiraut. And then they make this Lyons, the Suduiraut. What they have done over the years is they've done replantings. And they've done replantings to kind of feature dry whites. You know, they, instead of planting for Sauterne, they're actually planting vineyards within their vineyard for dry whites. And this comes from one specific block where you have the gravelly, sandy soils, which is great for Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon. And so this wine from the 22 vintage, a very warm vintage, but again, in Sauterne kind of gets that fog in the morning, and that's what creates this botrytis that makes the sweet wines. But for the dry whites, they pick them a little bit earlier, and in a warm vintage, they got ripe. But the thing is the wine has focus and acidity and freshness. And this was the one thing we talked about 22s. I don't know if you followed Kyle and I when we were doing our 22 en premier wines, the red wines. And that was one of the words that they said in Bordeaux, like almost every chateau, or every place we went. Freshness, there's freshness in the wine. There's low pHs, which is kind of weird when you have a warm vintage. So this wine, 54% Semillon, 46% Sauvignon Blanc. It's done half in vat and half in barrel, the aging, and it's aged 6 months. 20% of the wood being new. So, I mean, they put some serious some serious effort into this wine. And the result is I don't want to say it's a classic Bordeaux white, because Sauternes, the wines have a different flair to them. You get like pear and you get passion fruit, but you also get kind of a nuttiness, like almost like a hazelnut character in the wine, which I really love. The Semillon gives this wine weight. It makes it more serious. So this is a gastronomic wine, or, you could porch pound this as well, because it's got the fruit, that citrusy passion fruit kind of vibe to it. But it also has the weight and the weight of the Semillon. And that actually, for 20 bucks, makes this a stunning wine. Boy, it's good. 92 points, Jim Suckling. That matters. We only have one little batch of this. This kind of reminds me a little bit of, even though it's a little bit different, but when we, I don't want to say it's like Ygritte, because it's not Ygritte, okay? And Ygritte's $130, but there's that Sauternes essence of how Ygritte tastes in this wine. And again, I don't want to make a direct comparison, but it's close. There's something there that, I don't know, maybe Sauternes has this terroir that's very different than anywhere else. Absolutely delicious. And I think a lot of that's 22 vintage. I think the 22 the fruit is very ripe and very lively, and I think that's where you maybe kind of get, by getting these little hints, because I love Ygritte. Truly one of my favorite white wines in the world, and this is pretty damn good too, so you know what to do.